Imagine there's a historical figure that you really admire, and so you might want to read different biographies on this person. Would it make sense, though, to only read one biography about him or her? And furthermore, would it make sense to only read the one biography written by the very institution that was actually the main persecutor of the person that you admire, of the person that's being written about? Right? You probably heard the expression something along the lines of those who win the battle or win the war write the history, right? Would it make sense to only read history even on like an historical event? Would it make sense to only read the version written by the people that won rather than hear the other side, especially if you admire those that actually lost the battle or who were conquered? I say this, of course, in the context of studying the words and works of Jesus Christ, of Yeshua HaMashiach, and what we know of as the modern Bible, right? There are other historical texts that talk about Yeshua and talk about the original 12 apostles. And if you really want to be his follower, if you really do admire and love him, why would you limit your research on him to only one book? And again, this book actually written by church authorities, which the equivalent in his day were his main opponent, right? That pushed for his torture and crucifixion, right? So it doesn't make rational sense, right? It's showing a form of idolatry. It's showing that you believe that the authors and translators and editors of just this one particular compilation of texts is the only one worth reading and the only one that contains truth, and that it's the only source for better understanding Jesus Christ, right? It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make academic sense, right? It doesn't make sense from the standpoint of just doing good research, right? People don't limit their research this way concerning other historical figures, or even say someone just really likes a celebrity. They would put more effort into reading more and getting more sides of the story than they do for the person that they claim is their Lord and Savior. In the first part of this talk, I mentioned psychological characteristics that correspond to someone who is a member of a cult, and in particular, members of a cult that idolize a cult leader. And so I did a little research on that as far as what are common characteristics of someone who's kind of idolizing a cult leader. And it was interesting the few things that came up as common psychological characteristics. So one is that the cult member has this mindset of loyalty above all. In particular, loyalty above facts and logic. That if anything is presented that contradicts the perfect goodness of their leader, they just dismiss it immediately, and they prioritize just loyalty over the evidence and reason, right? So that happens a lot with bringing up criticism of the letters of Paul. Like in the first part of this talk, I point out that it makes no sense to think that Jesus would casually reference pagan god Dionysus, right? But this is just dismissed, and people say, well, it can actually be an issue. One way or another, we're just going to rationalize and spin this into nothing and maintain our loyalty to Paul, right? So this goes along with another characteristic, similar one, called confirmation bias. This is when someone selectively interprets information to confirm their pre-existing beliefs and dismiss contradictory evidence. So they'll have this bias that basically blinds them to the contradictory evidence or reasoning. And this goes along with groupthink, and that's conforming one's thoughts to the views and norms of their particular group. So obviously in a cult, they have groupthink going on within the cult, right? And so Paulinists will often support each other in their groupthink. You could call that an echo chamber, and think that because they all agree with each other and they're all on the same page, that Paul is definitely a true apostle and said and did no wrong, that somehow trumps facts and logic, in an objective perspective. And finally, there's the emotional investment, which goes along with a logical fallacy called the sunk cost fallacy, meaning that if you've already invested so much in something, even though it's showing bad returns, like if we're talking about like a financial investment, for example, you can think, well, I've already invested so much in this, I'm not getting any profit from it, but because of the length of time that I've invested in it, I don't want to back out now, right? So it's this strong emotional attachment to whatever it is that you've invested in, and that can be a person or an ideology or a dogma like Paulinism. I've heard people say sometimes that Paulinists suffer from cognitive dissonance, and that's true as well, but the way cognitive dissonance is normally defined, I think, is inaccurate. It's normally defined as holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time. But Paulinists don't actually hold two contradictory beliefs. Like I've been saying with the confirmation bias and the groupthink and the loyalty above all and the sunk cost fallacy, they're not actually changing their belief. It's that when they encounter the opposing belief, they have a visceral negative reaction to it. They reject it. So they don't hold it, right? Holding and rejecting are not synonymous. They're actually antonyms, right? So this majority view on cognitive dissonance needs some improvement. Some researchers have come to the same conclusion I have on it, but it's a minority view still. And taking this understanding of cognitive dissonance further to an even deeper level of understanding about it, this visceral negative reaction that occurs when an opposing belief happens because the belief that's held and being contradicted is a deeply seated belief. You could say that it's a belief that they've personally identified with, and so that's the key element that results in the cognitive dissonance. When someone sees their own identity as a human being connected with a personal belief, with a particular belief, if someone attacks that or criticizes that belief or presents evidence that shows that belief may be wrong, they have this immediate defensive reaction because it's actually a threat on their identity and therefore their own life, you could say. And so I think really what cognitive dissonance is just another name for fear of death, actually. And that's why their reaction is so visceral and lacking in critical thought, because it's fearful. And fearful thinking is not intelligent thinking, right? Fear lowers our awareness and ability to think critically. So that's why you just get these very emotional, negative reactions that lack any reasoning. They've identified themselves as, say, a Bible-believing Christian, right? That the Bible is the Word of God, and this is who they are, right? They've repeated that mantra so many times that they can't imagine disconnecting from that belief. It's become integral to who they are. They actually identify as that. Like, if someone were to say, well, who are you? They'd say, well, I'm a man or a woman I'm a Bible-believing man or woman, right? It would be front and center on just their fundamental sense of personal identity. And that's the problem. And that's why they can't, at least initially, really listen, because they're clinging to this fear of death, this cognitive dissonance, along with the confirmation bias and groupthink and emotional investment overall, in this idolatrous loyalty above all of it working together to be a mental block to hearing, sound, reasoning. So returning to Revelation chapter 2, when Jesus is talking to uh, early churches there, right? The Ephesians and the uh, Pergamines, I believe is how it's pronounced. Uh, in particular, I'm referencing Revelation 2, verse 6 and Revelation 2, verse 15, where Yeshua makes it clear that he hates the works and doctrine of the Nicolaitans. And so I just mentioned in passing that that doctrine corresponds with the teachings of Paul, but that deserves further explanation. So I'll do that now. So the doctrine of the Nicolaitans is known as a form of antinomianism. So antinomianism does correspond with what I said it does basically. In the first part, I said it's basically a type of moral relativism or moral nihilism. So in the context of soteriology or salvation, the context of theology here in a Christian context, it refers to this, what's called a hyper grace theology, right? That basically anything is permissible, right? That works don't matter at all. And, once saved, always saved. And that's why it's similar or can also be referred to as moral nihilism, right? Ethics is just no longer important, right? And Paul does multiple times say pretty much exactly that it's not by works that we're saved. It's just faith. It's just belief in the blood power, right? The atonement theology, right? That by killing an innocent person, you can be saved from hell. You can enter heaven by just believing in the power of shedding the blood of an innocent person. But Paulinus will counter this by saying, well, no, there was, a couple of times when Paul did say something good about, doing good works. But the problem is he contradicted himself, right? And on top of that, if we just take an objective look at what the main message is of most Christian churches, of the Pauline Christian church, it's definitely heavily leaning on the works don't matter, and if you think they do, you're not being humble, right? You're boasting, right? Referring to Paul's words there again. Like, I just turned on Christian radio station a little while ago, about 20 minutes ago, and sure enough, as per usual, there's this message. There was, I guess, someone that works for the radio station, giving some commentary between songs, and she said, he, referring to Jesus, he doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called, right? They love this doctrine. They just, I would say, revel in it and just repeat it over and over and over again. Free grace, the power of his blood, right? This is the main message over and over and over again. Again, completely disregarding what Yeshua actually taught about salvation, which again is linked to keeping his commandments. And he clarified what the true moral law is with the greatest commandments, right? To love God, others, and ourselves, right? So they're constantly emphasizing this free grace or hyper grace, which is really one and the same with antinomianism, which is really one and the same with the doctrine of the Nicolaitans that Yeshua specifically said that he hated, right? And he commended those that were rejecting it too, that hated it too, and that were rejecting people that call themselves apostles but are not true apostles, right? I'll quote here again exactly from Revelation 2:2. Quote, this is Jesus talking. This is Yeshua. I know your works, your toil and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear evil men, but have tested those who call themselves apostles, but are not, and found them to be false. And then in verse 6, he says, yet this you have, you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, right? That's interesting too there in verse 7, that he added that. He who has an ear, meaning really listen to what I'm saying, really look into what I'm saying here. How many Paulinist Christians really do that? I don't think very many. And if they are pointed to the similarities between the works and doctrines of the Nicolaitans and their own Pauline theology, they'll once again spin it, they'll once again rationalize it, exercising those qualities of a follower of a cult leader, exercising those psychological characteristics that lack critical thought, and just display this idolatrous loyalty above all, this confirmation bias, this groupthink, this sunk cost fallacy, and cognitive dissonance. And this includes other sound criticism of the letters in Paul, including what I mentioned concerning his pro-slavery messaging. Right, in Ephesians 6:5 and 1 Timothy 6:1 and 2 and elsewhere. And oftentimes they'll just say, well, according to 1 Peter, Peter said the same thing. Literally, like the same exact words, right? Quote, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect, right? This slave, obey your earthly masters with respect. It's just repeated word for word. And we're supposed to believe that Peter, the true apostle of Yeshua, said the same exact thing, right? Approved by these church authorities. Never mind all the scholars that have found 1 Peter demonstrating many characteristics of a forgery, right? Never mind that in Book 17 of the Clementine Homilies, Peter is quoted as saying that Paul is his enemy, right? Never mind the Acts of Peter and the Epistle of Peter to Philip that also highlight disagreements between Peter and Paul, right? Never mind all the evidence to the contrary. Never mind that what Paul was saying was wicked, right? It was this explicitly pro-slavery message that Jesus never communicated, and we should never expect him to communicate, right? He came to set the captives free, and he was teaching a gospel of comprehensive love. So it's obviously incompatible with advocating or supporting or condoning abusive slavery of other human beings. But you need to think independently, and you need to not be an idol worshiper of individuals or particular books or so-called authorities in order to get the truth more clear in your mind and be able to align with it in your daily life. All right, thanks for listening.